Hashtag 93-year-old veteran bullied by bikers until he makes a sudden twist. Hashtag part 1. The quiet corner. The bell above Joey's Diner's door chimed at exactly 2:00 p.m., just as it had every Tuesday for the past 15 years. Frank Thompson, a 93-year-old veteran with silver hair and careful posture, stepped inside. His clean, pressed blue shirt and khaki pants showed not a single wrinkle, and his old brown leather shoes were polished to a soft shine. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thompson." Sarah, the young waitress with kind eyes, called out from behind the counter. She was already reaching for the coffee pot before Frank could settle into his usual corner booth. This booth, with its worn red leather seats and small view of the street, had become Frank's special place in the small Milwaukee diner. The old veteran moved slowly but steadily, his joints stiff from the years but his back still straight with military bearing. A small American flag pin sparkled on his collar, catching the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the large windows. As he sat down, he carefully placed his worn leather wallet on the table and smoothed the paper placemat in front of him. "Your usual coffee and apple pie, Mr. Thompson?" Sarah asked, even though she already knew the answer. She had been serving Frank for 3 years now, and his order never changed. "Yes, please, Sarah," Frank replied with a gentle smile. His voice was soft but clear, carrying the weight of years of stories beneath its surface. While Sarah went to get his order, Frank looked around the diner he knew so well. The chrome fixtures still sparkled. The jukebox in the corner played old tunes softly, and the smell of fresh coffee and baked pies filled the air. Other regular customers nodded hello to Frank. There was Bob, the mailman, taking his late lunch break. Mary, the librarian from down the street, sat reading her book at the counter. They all knew Frank, even if they didn't know his whole story. To them, he was the quiet veteran who loved apple pie and always left a good tip. As Frank waited for his pie, his mind wandered back to earlier days. His fingers, though wrinkled now, still remembered the feel of motorcycle handlebars and the weight of important messages in his courier bag. But those were memories he kept to himself, stored away like the old photographs in his wallet. Sarah returned with a slice of golden brown apple pie and a steaming cup of black coffee. She placed them carefully on the table, making sure the fork was on the left side of the plate, just as Frank liked it. "Here you go, Mr. Thompson. The pie's extra fresh today. Betty just baked it an hour ago." Frank thanked her and began his Tuesday ritual. First, he would take a small sip of coffee, testing its temperature. Then he would cut the pie into neat, even pieces with his fork. Each bite was taken slowly, savored with the appreciation of someone who knew that life's simple pleasures were worth taking time for. Through the window, Frank watched the world go by. Cars passed on the street, people walked their dogs, and life moved at its own pace. In his corner booth, Frank had found a peaceful spot where he could be part of the world while keeping to himself. The other customers came and went, the bell above the door chiming with each arrival and departure. But Frank stayed in his booth, taking his time with his coffee and pie. He didn't know that this Tuesday would be different from all the others. He couldn't have guessed that his quiet corner of the world was about to change. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the diner's windows, Frank finished his pie and left his usual generous tip under the coffee cup. He stood up carefully, nodded goodbye to Sarah, and walked slowly toward the door. Tomorrow would be another day, but next Tuesday he would be back in his corner booth at Joey's Diner, just as he had been for the past 15 years. Little did Frank know that his peaceful Tuesday routine was about to face an unexpected challenge. The rumble of motorcycles could already be heard in the distance, growing closer to Joey's Diner with each passing day. The following Tuesday started like any other at Joey's Diner, but everything changed at 1:45 p.m. The peaceful afternoon was suddenly filled with the loud roar of motorcycle engines. 6 large bikes pulled into the parking lot, their chrome pipes gleaming in the sunlight. The riders, wearing black leather jackets with red riders' patches, walked into the diner like they owned the place. Sarah, who was preparing Frank's usual corner booth, looked up nervously as the bell above the door chimed repeatedly. The bikers were big men, covered in tattoos, with long beards and heavy boots that thumped against the checkered floor. Their leader, a tall man with a thick gray beard who everyone called Steele, pointed to the large booth near Frank's corner. "That's our spot now," Steele announced loudly, his voice rough like gravel. The other customers in the diner tried not to stare, but everyone could feel the change in the atmosphere. The quiet afternoon music from the jukebox seemed to fade away under the bikers' loud voices and rough laughter. At exactly 2 o'clock p.m., Frank Thompson walked through the door. He paused for a moment, taking in the unusual scene. The smell of leather and motorcycle exhaust now mixed with the usual coffee and pie aromas. Sarah caught his eye and gave him an apologetic look as she hurried past with plates of burgers and fries for the bikers. Frank moved slowly to his corner booth, passing close to where the Red Riders sat. One of the younger bikers, wearing a bandana and dark sunglasses, elbowed his friend and nodded toward Frank. "Look at this old-timer," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Think he fought in the Civil War." Some of the bikers laughed, but Frank kept walking, his face calm and his back straight. He sat down in his usual spot, though now the peaceful quiet of his corner was gone. The bikers' loud conversations about their motorcycles and road trips filled the entire diner. Sarah brought Frank his coffee and pie, having to squeeze past two of the bikers to reach his table. "I'm sorry about the noise, Mr. Thompson," she whispered. "They showed up just before you arrived." "It's all right, Sarah," Frank replied softly, giving her a gentle smile. The diner's open to everyone, but his hands shook slightly as he lifted his coffee cup, something that didn't go unnoticed by the bikers. "Hey, Gramps," Steele called out. "Better be careful with that coffee. Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself." More laughter followed from the group. Frank continued eating his pie in small, careful bites, trying to maintain his dignity despite the unwanted attention. The other regular customers watched uncomfortably. Bob the mailman left early, leaving an extra-large tip for Sarah. Mary the librarian kept her head down, pretending to read her book. The afternoon dragged on, feeling longer than usual. Every few minutes, another comment or laugh would come from the bikers' table. They made fun of Frank's careful eating habits, his pressed clothes, and the way he arranged his napkin on his lap. When it was time to leave, Frank stood up slowly, leaving his usual tip under the coffee cup. As he walked toward the door, he had to pass the bikers' table again. This time, Steele stuck out his boot slightly, not enough to trip Frank, but enough to make him step carefully around it. "Watch your step, old-timer," Steele said with a smirk. "Wouldn't want you to fall and break a hip." Frank made it to the door without responding, but everyone could see his shoulders were tenser than usual. As he stepped outside, the sound of the bikers' laughter followed him. Sarah watched through the window as Frank walked to his old car. For the first time in 15 years, she saw him pause before getting in, his head bowed slightly. She worried about next Tuesday, wondering if Frank would still come back to face more harassment. What nobody knew yet was that Frank Thompson had faced much worse than a group of bullying bikers in his life. The quiet veteran might have seemed weak and vulnerable, but behind his gentle appearance lay a strength and a story that would soon change everything at Joey's Diner. The next few Tuesdays became harder and harder for Frank Thompson. Instead of arriving at his usual time of 2 o'clock p.m., he started coming to Joey's Diner at 1:30 p.m., hoping to finish his pie before the Red Riders showed up. But somehow, the bikers seemed to know his plan. They too began arriving earlier, making sure Frank couldn't enjoy his peaceful afternoon. On this particular Tuesday, Frank sat in his corner booth, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. The diner felt different now. Regular customers had started avoiding Tuesday afternoons, leaving many booths empty. Only Mary the librarian still came, sitting quietly at the counter, worried about leaving Frank alone with the bikers. "Well, look who's trying to dodge us." Steele's voice boomed across the diner as the Red Riders walked in. Their heavy boots echoed on the floor as they headed to their usual spot. "Missing your war buddies, old man. Bet most of them are gone now, aren't they?" Frank's fingers tightened around his coffee cup, but his face remained calm. Sarah, watching from behind the counter, saw a flash of something in his eyes, not fear, but something deeper, like a distant memory stirring. "Hey, Sarah," one of the younger bikers called out. "Better bring Gramps a sippy cup. His hands are shaking again." The group burst into laughter, their voices drowning out the soft music playing from the jukebox. Sarah walked over to Frank's table, pretending she needed to refill his coffee. "Mr. Thompson," she whispered, "I can ask them to leave. Betty says we don't need their business if they're going to act like this." Frank shook his head slightly. "Don't worry about me, Sarah. I've seen worse days." His voice was quiet but steady, carrying a hint of strength that made Sarah pause. Steele, noticing their whispered conversation, stood up and walked over to Frank's booth. His massive frame cast a shadow over the table. "Sharing war stories, are we?" he asked, leaning down. "Tell us, old-timer, what's the scariest thing you ever saw? A paper cut at the army office?" The other bikers snickered. One of them, a younger man called Razor, looked uncomfortable. He had noticed the small American flag pin on Frank's collar, shining under the diner's lights. Frank took another small bite of his apple pie, chewing slowly and deliberately. His silence seemed to irritate Steele even more. "Maybe he can't hear us," Steele said loudly. "Hey, GRINDPA." He slammed his hand on the table, making the coffee cup rattle in its saucer. "I'm talking to you." For the first time, Frank looked directly at Steele. His blue eyes, though aged, held a steadiness that made the biker leader blink. "Young man," Frank said quietly, "my hearing is just fine, and so is my memory." Something in Frank's tone made Steele step back slightly, though he quickly covered his surprise with another laugh. "Oh, the old man speaks, and he calls me young man. Isn't that cute, boys?" But a few of the bikers weren't laughing anymore. They had noticed how Frank sat, straight-backed, shoulders squared, despite his age. They saw the way his weathered hands, though wrinkled, held his coffee cup with purpose. Sarah brought over a fresh slice of pie, placing it carefully in front of Frank. As she did, she noticed a small tattoo on his wrist, mostly hidden by his shirt sleeve, something she had never seen before in all these years. "Maybe next Tuesday we should bring our bikes right up to his window," Steele said to his gang. "Give him a real good rumble to go with his coffee." Frank finished his pie in silence, but today he didn't leave early. He sat there, sipping his coffee, his eyes focused on something distant, as if seeing beyond the diner walls. The bikers continued their taunts, but they couldn't hide their growing curiosity about this quiet old man who refused to be scared away. What they didn't know was that Frank Thompson had made a decision. Next Tuesday would be different. Next Tuesday, he would bring something with him, something that had been tucked away in his wallet for over 70 years. Something that would change everything. Tuesday arrived with dark clouds hanging over Milwaukee. Inside Joey's diner, Sarah watched the clock nervously. It was 1:55 p.m., and both Frank Thompson and the Red Riders would arrive soon. Today felt different somehow. There was a tension in the air that even the other customers could feel. The bell chimed as Frank walked in, right on time at 2:00 p.m. Today, he wore his best blue shirt with pressed collar, and his American flag pin seemed to shine brighter than usual. In his hand, he carried his old leather wallet, holding it more carefully than normal. Before Sarah could get his coffee, the rumble of motorcycles filled the air. The Red Riders roared into the parking lot, their bikes louder than ever. Steele led his gang through the door, making it slam against the wall with a bang that made everyone jump. Everyone except Frank. "Look alive, Grandpa," Steele shouted, walking straight to Frank's booth. "Beautiful day for some coffee spilling, isn't it?" The other bikers spread out behind their leader, but today, some of them looked unsure, noticing something different about the old veteran's demeanor. Frank sat calmly, arranging his napkin on his lap as Sarah brought his coffee and apple pie. His hands were steady, showing no sign of the shaking that the bikers usually mocked. "What's wrong, old-timer?" Steele leaned over the table. "Cat got your tum today?" He reached out and deliberately bumped Frank's table, hard enough to make the coffee slosh over the cup's rim, forming a brown puddle on the white tablecloth. The diner fell silent. Mary the librarian stopped pretending to read her book. Sarah froze behind the counter. Even the jukebox seemed to go quiet. Slowly, very slowly, Frank Thompson stood up. Despite his 93 years, he drew himself to his full height. His back was straight, his shoulders squared, just as they had been all those years ago. For the first time, the bikers noticed that even though age had weathered him, Frank Thompson still had the bearing of a soldier. "Young man," Frank said, his voice clear and strong, "I've been patient with your disrespect. I've sat quietly through your mockery. But today, I think it's time you learned something about judgment and appearances." Steele started to laugh, but the sound died in his throat as Frank reached for his wallet. The old veteran's movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as he opened the worn leather and pulled out a yellowed photograph. "Before you spill any more of my coffee," Frank said, "you might want to look at this." He placed the photograph carefully on the table, smoothing out its worn edges. The image was black and white, faded with age but still clear. Several of the bikers, curiosity getting the better of them, leaned in to look. Their eyes widened. Sarah, who had never seen the photo before, moved closer too. Even Steele found himself staring at the image, his usual smirk fading from his face. The photograph showed a young soldier, handsome and strong, sitting astride a massive military motorcycle. He wore a uniform covered in medals, and his face, unmistakably a younger version of Frank Thompson, showed the confident smile of a man who had faced danger and survived. But it wasn't just any military motorcycle in the photograph. It was a Harley-Davidson Bullied, one of the most legendary bikes ever made, the same type of motorcycle that hung in a place of honor in the Red Riders clubhouse. That was taken in 1944, Frank said quietly, just before we rode through enemy lines in France. Our motorcycle courier unit carried messages that helped win the war. We rode through gunfire, past enemy patrols, in darkness and rain, because those messages had to get through. Steele's face had lost all its arrogance. He stared at the photograph, then at Frank, then back at the photograph. The old veteran they had been mocking suddenly stood before them in a completely different light. The diner remained silent as Frank reached down to wipe the spilled coffee with his napkin. But before he could touch it, Steele's hand shot out, not to cause more trouble, but to grab a clean napkin from his own table. "Let me get that for you, sir," Steele said, his voice completely changed. "And I think you have a story we need to hear." The atmosphere in Joey's diner had completely changed. The Red Riders, who moments ago had been laughing and mocking Frank Thompson, now pulled their chairs closer to his booth. Steele, their leader, sat directly across from Frank, holding the old photograph with careful hands. "I was 23 when that picture was taken," Frank began, his voice carrying the weight of memories. "Our motorcycle courier unit was called the Ghost Riders because we could slip past enemy lines like spirits in the night. Sarah brought fresh coffee for everyone, and for the first time on a Tuesday afternoon, Joey's diner was filled with respectful silence. Even Mary the librarian moved closer to hear Frank's story. That Harley-Davidson Bullied," Frank continued, pointing to the motorcycle in the photo, "was more than just a machine. She saved my life more times than I can count. We called her Thunder because of the way her engine roared through the French countryside." Steele leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the military-equipped motorcycle. "Sir, I've only seen one of these in real life. It's in a museum behind glass. You actually rode one in combat." Frank nodded, a small smile crossing his face. "Rode one? Son, I lived on that bike for 2 years. We carried messages that couldn't be risked over radio. Maps, battle plans, intelligence reports. All had to be delivered by hand, through enemy territory." He reached into his wallet again and pulled out another photograph, this one showing a group of young men standing beside their motorcycles, all of them wearing leather courier jackets. "This was my unit," Frank said softly. 20 of us started. 12 made it home." His finger touched each face in the photo gently, as if greeting old friends. "We rode in all conditions, rain, snow, under gunfire. The messages had to get through, no matter what." One of the younger bikers, Razor, spoke up. Did you have to fight while riding?" Frank's eyes grew distant. "One night, I was carrying crucial intelligence about German troop movements. 3 enemy motorcycles spotted me near Normandy. The chase lasted for 20 minutes, through dark country roads. They were shooting, but Thunder and we knew how to dance." He paused, taking a sip of coffee. Everyone in the diner leaned closer, completely captivated. "I had to drive with one hand and use my service pistol with the other. Thunder knew what to do. She responded to every shift of my weight, every subtle command. We lost them in an olive grove, delivered the intelligence, and the information helped save an entire company of Allied soldiers." Steele shook his head in amazement. Those bikes weren't like today's motorcycles. No special suspension, no fancy brakes. Just raw machine and skill. "That's right," Frank agreed. "We maintained them ourselves. Every nut, every bolt, we knew our bikes inside and out. Had to. Our lives depended on it." He pointed to a detail in the first photo. "See that extra cable running along the frame? That was my own modification. Helped with quick gear changes during emergency maneuvers." The bikers exchanged looks of newfound respect, Their own rides, parked outside, suddenly seemed luxurious compared to the wartime motorcycles Frank had ridden. After particularly dangerous missions, Frank continued, we'd gather around our bikes, patch up any bullet holes, and share whatever coffee and cigarettes we had. The bond between a rider and their machine. You boys understand that, don't you? The Red Riders nodded solemnly. They did understand. It was the same bond they shared with their own motorcycles, even if they had never faced the dangers Frank had. Sarah, who had been listening intently, noticed tears in the eyes of some of the toughest-looking bikers. The story of the Ghost Riders of young Frank Thompson and his Thunder had touched something deep in their riders' hearts. Mr. Thompson, Steele said, his voice thick with emotion, we've been disrespecting a legend. A true motorcycle warrior. He carefully handed the photographs back to Frank. Would you tell us more? Frank smiled, a hint of his young self showing through his aged features. Well, he said, there was this one night in Belgium. He paused, looking at the eager faces around him. But first, Sarah, I think we're going to need more coffee, and maybe enough apple pie for everyone. The Tuesday afternoon stretched into evening at Joey's diner. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through the windows, and nobody seemed to notice the time passing. Frank Thompson sat in his usual corner booth, now surrounded by the Red Riders who hung on his every word. And that's when Thunder's engine started making a strange noise. Frank continued his story, his hands moving as he spoke. We were deep behind enemy lines, and I could hear German patrols nearby. I had to fix her right there, in the dark, using only touch and memory. Steele shook his head in amazement. No flashlight, no tools. Just what I carried in my pockets, Frank replied, pulling an old multi-tool from his wallet. This same one, in fact. Still carry it every day. Never know when you might need to make repairs. The bikers passed around the worn tool with reverence, as if holding a sacred relic. It had helped save lives during the war, and here it was, still in perfect working condition after all these years. Sarah brought another round of coffee, smiling at how different things were from just a few hours ago. The Red Riders, who had been so cruel to Frank, now treated him like a respected elder. Even their body language had changed. They sat up straighter, showed proper respect, and said, "Sir," when addressing him. Mr. Thompson, Razor spoke up. What happened to Thunder after the war? Did you get to keep her? A touch of sadness crossed Frank's face. No, son. Most of the military bikes were left in Europe. But he reached into his wallet one more time and pulled out a small, tarnished key. I kept her ignition key. Never could bring myself to part with it. Steele studied the key with glistening eyes. Like many bikers, he understood the deep connection between a rider and their machine. Sir, we've been absolute fools, he said finally, his voice heavy with regret. We disrespected not just a veteran, but a true motorcycle legend. The other Red Riders nodded in agreement, looking ashamed of their previous behavior. One of them, a large man called Bear, stood up suddenly. We need to make this right, Bear announced. He walked outside and returned a minute later carrying something wrapped in leather. Mr. Thompson, we'd like you to have this. Frank carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was a brand new leather vest, similar to what the Red Riders wore, but this one was special. On the back was the Red Riders patch, but above it was another patch, one showing a World War II motorcycle with the words, Ghost Rider, Honorary Legend, emblazoned around it. We had this made at the shop down the street while you were telling your stories, Steele explained. Would you do us the honor of becoming an honorary member of our club? For a moment, Frank sat very still, his weathered hands touching the vest gently. Then, to everyone's surprise, his eyes filled with tears. I haven't worn leather since 1945, he said softly. Steele and Bear helped Frank put on the vest. It fit perfectly over his pressed blue shirt, the patches gleaming under the diner's lights. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she watched, and even Mary the librarian was dabbing at her face with a napkin. There's more, sir, Steele added. From now on, every Tuesday is Veterans Day at our club. We'd be honored if you'd come by and share more of your stories with us. And, he smiled, your coffee and pie will always be on us, both here and at the clubhouse. Frank stood up, and despite his 93 years, he suddenly looked taller, stronger. The leather vest seemed to bring back some of the young motorcycle courier he had once been. The Red Riders stood too, forming a circle of respect around him. "Thank you, boys," Frank said, his voice steady but full of emotion. Thunder would be proud to see this day. As the sun set completely outside Joey's diner, the sound of respectful laughter and storytelling could be heard through the windows. Where there had been conflict, there was now camaraderie. Where there had been mockery, there was now honor. And in his corner booth, wearing his new leather vest, Frank Thompson finally felt at home among fellow riders once again. The next Tuesday at Joey's diner was unlike any other in the diner's history. Regular customers stopped in their tracks as they entered, surprised by what they saw. The Red Riders had completely transformed Frank's corner into what they called the Ghost Rider's Corner. They had carefully hung a large, framed American flag on the wall beside his booth. Under it was a beautifully restored vintage photograph of a military Harley-Davidson Bullied, similar to Frank's old Thunder. Steele had found it at an antique shop and had it professionally framed. Frank arrived at his usual time, 2:00 p.m. sharp, wearing his new leather vest over his pressed blue shirt. But today, he wasn't alone. The Red Riders had sent their youngest member, Razor, to pick him up from his home in a comfortable car. No more driving alone for their honorary legend. "Welcome home, sir," the bikers called out as Frank entered. They had already ordered his coffee and apple pie, arranged perfectly on the table. Sarah beamed as she watched from behind the counter, remembering how different things had been just a week ago. "Boys," Frank nodded, a warm smile on his face. Today, he carried a small box under his arm. "I brought something to share with you." As Frank sat down, the bikers gathered around eagerly. He opened the box carefully, revealing a collection of old photographs, maps, and documents from his war days. Each item had been preserved with care for over 70 years. "This," Frank said, pulling out a worn map, "was my last mission route through France. See these markings? Each one shows where Thunder and I had close calls with enemy patrols." Steele studied the map with deep respect. "You rode through all that territory alone, sir." "Not alone," Frank corrected him gently. "Thunder was with me. A good bike is never just a machine, it's a trusted partner." The other bikers nodded in understanding. They knew exactly what he meant. Bear, who usually looked so tough, wiped a tear from his eye when Frank showed them a piece of shrapnel he had kept, the same piece that had almost hit Thunder's gas tank during a dangerous night ride. As the afternoon went on, more people started coming to Joey's diner on Tuesdays. Word had spread about the remarkable change in the Red Riders and their special relationship with the World War II veteran. The diner had become a place where young and old came together, united by their love of motorcycles and respect for history. "Mr. Thompson," Razor said during a quiet moment, "would you teach me how to maintain my bike the way you maintain Thunder? I want to learn from the best." Frank's eyes lit up. "Of course, son. First lesson, a motorcycle isn't just something you ride, it's something you need to understand, to feel, to respect." The other bikers pulled out notepads, not wanting to miss any of Frank's wisdom. Here was a man who had kept a military motorcycle running through a war, often with nothing but basic tools and determination. His knowledge was precious. Sarah, bringing another round of coffee, couldn't help but smile at the sight. The tough-looking bikers were like schoolchildren, eagerly learning from their newfound mentor. Even Steele, their leader, was writing down notes as Frank explained his old maintenance techniques. "Next week," Frank announced, "I'll bring my old maintenance manual from the war. It has all my personal notes in the margins, tricks we learned the hard way. We'll make copies for everyone in the club," Steele declared. "These are lessons that shouldn't be lost." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the diner's windows, Frank looked around at his new family. These men, who had once mocked him, now treated him with more respect than he had received in years. "You know, boys," Frank said, adjusting his leather vest proudly, "Thunder would have loved to see this. She always brought people together, even in the darkest times." The Red Riders raised their coffee cups in a salute. "To Thunder," they said in unison, "and to our Ghost Rider." Joey's Diner had become more than just a place to eat. It had become a place where the past and present came together, where wisdom was passed down, and where an unlikely brotherhood had formed between a 93-year-old veteran and a group of bikers who had learned to look beyond appearances to find the hero within. 1 month had passed since the day Frank Thompson first showed his wartime photograph at Joey's Diner. The changes in that short time were remarkable. Every Tuesday had become a special event that people from all over Milwaukee didn't want to miss. This particular Tuesday was even more special. The Red Riders had planned something extraordinary for their honorary Ghost Rider. As Frank arrived at the diner for his usual 2 p.m. coffee and pie, he stopped in the parking lot, his eyes wide with emotion. There, gleaming in the afternoon sun, stood a perfectly restored 1942 Harley-Davidson WLA military motorcycle. It wasn't Thunder, but it was exactly the same model Frank had ridden during the war. Steele and the Red Riders had spent 3 weeks searching for one, finally finding it in a collector's garage 2 states away. "Happy birthday, Mr. Thompson," Steele said softly, standing beside the bike. The other Red Riders gathered around, all wearing special patches on their vests that read Ghost Rider's Guard. Frank walked slowly around the motorcycle, his hand touching the familiar curves and angles. His fingers traced the military markings, the special brackets that once held message pouches, the same modifications he had made to Thunder all those years ago. "Boys," Frank's voice trembled slightly, "how did you know it was my birthday?" Sarah stepped forward from the diner's entrance. "I remembered the date from your first credit card payment, 15 years ago. I told Steele last week. The motorcycle wasn't just for show. The Red Riders had made sure it was in perfect running condition." Steele held out the key to Frank, its brass surface polished to a shine. "Would you do us the honor, sir?" Steele asked. "One more ride?" Frank took the key, holding it like a precious jewel. He hadn't ridden a motorcycle in decades, but his hands remembered exactly what to do. With surprising agility for his 93 years, he swung his leg over the seat and settled in. The position was so familiar, it felt like coming home. The bike started with the same deep rumble he remembered. Tears rolled down Frank's cheeks as the sound brought back a flood of memories. The Red Riders formed a protective circle around him on their own bikes, ready to escort their hero. "Just around the block, nice and easy," Steele assured him. "We'll be right with you." The small parade of motorcycles moved slowly through the streets of Milwaukee. People stopped to watch and wave. Word had spread about Frank's story, and many knew they were witnessing something special. When they returned to Joey's diner, there was a crowd waiting. Mary the librarian had brought old newspapers with articles about motorcycle courier units in World War II. Bob the mailman had his camera ready to capture the moment. Even the mayor had stopped by to shake Frank's hand. Inside, the diner had been decorated with American flags and vintage motorcycle posters. A large cake sat on Frank's table, decorated with a motorcycle design and the words "Happy Birthday, Ghost Rider." "This isn't just a celebration," Steele announced to the crowded diner. "This is the start of a new tradition. Every Tuesday, we'll escort Mr. Thompson to and from the diner. And once a month, weather permitting, we'll bring out this bike for a special ride." Frank stood tall in his leather vest, his eyes bright with joy. "In all my years," he said, "I never thought I'd find another family like my old motorcycle unit. But here you all are." The Red Riders had changed too. Under Frank's influence, they had started a veteran support program at their clubhouse. Every week, they helped elderly veterans with home repairs, transportation, and companionship. The tough bikers had found their true calling, honoring those who had served. As everyone enjoyed cake and coffee, Frank sat in his corner booth, now known throughout Milwaukee as the Ghost Rider's Corner. Above him hung his wartime photographs, his old map, and a new plaque that read, "Where respect rides with honor." Sarah, bringing Frank his usual apple pie, smiled at the scene. The diner had become more than just a place to eat. It was where a 93-year-old veteran had taught a group of bikers about true courage, where respect had replaced ridicule, and where every Tuesday became a reminder that it's never too late for hearts to change and new traditions to begin.